I'd love to hear a little about how you first started out, particularly because you were in LA, and I imagine there's quite a scene in LA. So could you perhaps start with that? What's it like teaching in LA?
Um, Teaching in LA is it's at this moment in time, it sort of feels like teaching in the epicenter of where yoga today, yoga as it's now being taught, as it's being learned, as it's being invented and reinvented. It's kind of the epicenter. It feels like Los Angeles. So I started teaching here in 2001, at the end of 2001, and it's definitely since that time the yoga scene here has done nothing but multiply and increase and replicate itself and re-innovate itself. But I think it's an exciting place to teach because there's so many different people, and it's a place, Los Angeles, is a place that has a far reach into the world. So part of the community that you're teaching are the writers and the filmmakers and the actors and the scene designers and a lot of different creative, innovative people that have influence in the mainstream media that goes out to the world.
Mm.
So it's one of the things I really appreciate about Los Angeles is its sprawl, its span to the rest of the world. And part of my own internal thinking about that is that if you can reach and influence the people who are reaching out and influencing other people, and you can help reset their mind, that has a reverberation that echoes through the rest of the world. So that's one of the things I like the most about it. On the flip side, what's challenging about it is there are so many yoga teachers and so many yoga studios that it can feel that you're it can feel like you're a little bit lost in a huge sprawling scene, but it's not that's not something I spend too much time thinking about. Um, but I think it's also another thing I really appreciate about Los Angeles is that it's yoga is well integrated into the mainstream here. So it's not something as other places I've traveled to where you're trying to recruit people or convince people that this is a good thing to do. There's a high level of education and understanding and appreciation for it. So
Makes it a little easier.
yeah, exactly.
So how did you first make an income when you began teaching for the first time?
Um,
Were you working at another job, or were you full time? Did you dive straight in?
well, when I took my yoga teacher training, I was at that time a writer and director myself. So I had been already struggling to make ends meet as a writer and director. Um, and from really the first time that I taught yoga for money was from an invitation to actually teach at a writer's boot camp,
Oh yeah,
um, to teach them yoga.
great.
And from that first invitation, I pretty much was able to get yoga teaching jobs out of the gate. I want to say within the first month of teaching, I was having about 13 or more classes a week. Um, I said yes to every single invitation. So it was pretty quickly within that first year that I was only teaching yoga full time. I didn't have a backup plan, so there wasn't really anything else to do. I just said yes to everything, and um, I looked at the first 4 years of teaching like a residency for a doctor. I said, okay, I'm going to, it's not, for me, it wasn't about how much money I could make, but the diversity of situations. So teaching in a yoga and spinning studio, teaching at a YMCA, teaching at variety of gyms, teaching privates to people for far, far under the asking price for yoga privates, teaching kids. Like I just said yes to pretty much every gig. And pretty much from that first month, I was making my income teaching yoga, which was lucky. I was kind of fortunate too. The time that I became a yoga teacher, it wasn't as saturated a market here in Los
Right.
Angeles as it might be now.
Right. And is there any reason why you picked 4 years as a period?
Well, my father's a doctor, and so I guess I always had kind of internalized. I think there was a part of me that had wanted to go to medical school, but I was always doing the math in my head about how many years it would take to become a doctor, at least based on the information I had from him. So there was something about, even though I think a residency might be a year or 2 years, in my mind, there was 4 years of residency that who knows what it was based on? Probably some misplaced piece of information in my head. I thought residency. Now that I'm looking back, that seems quite long. Um, but I also just felt somewhere in my head that was 4 years for university, 4 years to a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed fair that I didn't really know anything or have a huge amount of information until after 4 years. So
Mm-hmm.
that just became kind of my internal barometer for this is what I have to do, and then after this time, then I can sort of pick and choose.
So what happened after 4 years was up? Did you start being more picky?
Um, I'd say after 4 years, I didn't say yes to every job. I
Yeah.
mean, there was a point, and I can't tell you at how long it was into my career. It might have been in the first 3 or 4 years that I was having I had at one point 23 public classes a week,
Wow.
which is a lot for a teacher. That wasn't including private clients.
Right.
And so, teaching somewhere between 3 or 4 public classes a day was just not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
In terms, it was an amazing practice ground to be able to, for languaging and for a diversity of situation and a variety of bodies and a landscape for seeing. But in terms of being able to be physically present and qualitatively offering, there was diminishing returns at a certain point. So yeah, I would say after 4 years, mostly I started to pare down, like what places were there. Did it feel like the energy wasn't flowing? Did it seem like there was a challenge to get people there? What places did I energetically not feel great about every time I walked in? So I started to pare down based on that.
Mm-hmm.
And also what started to happen is the number of private clients increased, which was financially more beneficial than public classes, although I definitely prefer a public class to a private.
How so?
One of the things that feeds me and motivates me as a teacher is the energy of a classroom. It's the energy of a group of people coming together, moving together, communing together, to create an energetic experience. That is probably the primary thing that moves me as a teacher. And while a private client is rewarding because you can go deep and you can go far with a single person, you don't really get into that flow of what happens energetically when you facilitate a group happening. That's the thing I find in my life, that yoga, among a few other activities, is the thing that is facilitating that in the world. Like, concerts do that, some theater experiences do that, some parties do that, but I find that people have a need for a longing for group resonance, and there's such kind of disparity in our local environments, in urban environments, and people lacking connection, that yoga is a place that people can get that. So that's something I really live to be a part of.
So when did you begin traveling as a yoga teacher?
Well, I'd done probably in about 2006 and 2007, I started to have invitations to teach. I had some invitations to teach in New York City, and where friends of mine own studios, and in Wyoming and other places. I started to teach with one of my meditation teachers, Sally Kempton. I would teach yoga for some year-long programs that she was doing in various locations. But the big game changer for me was when I relocated to Bali in 2010, because the center, Desaseni, that I was teaching at in Canggu, there was local expat clientele that would come from often, 14, 15 different countries at a time in a single class, and also people traveling in. Because Bali is such a destination for people who like yoga now. I mean, in the current incarnation of Bali, and so many different countries, that gave me a bit of exposure. And simultaneously was the kind of rise of online studio that I teach for called Yoga Glow. So Yoga Glow, it started in 2009, and it took a few years for it to get a pretty broad base from different countries. But once that started happening, I had people coming to Bali who knew me also from Yoga Glow. And so with that, invitations started to come. And I've always been somebody who's followed invitations. I never really am a person to write to a studio to ask if I could teach there. It's just not, it's not really my style. So with Yoga Glow and Bali, those two things together, that started invitations coming from around the world.
So what would a typical year look like for you now?
Well, the last year was the first year that I had a friend of mine taught me to say no fixed abode. I truly, in 2012, I've traveled to 17 different countries. Wow. So I started in February, and I did a bit of Asia. I went to Cambodia, Thailand, and Bali, and then swung back to LA. And then from May through October, I was basically traveling through Australasia and Europe, from one week to the other in different places, with a stop in Bali that was about a month long, where I did a teacher training. And then I just keep traveling. Basically, from there I keep traveling. So now I'm in a period of intake, because I call those output periods and now intake periods. So since mid-November, I've been taking time off. I mean, Peru was a travel for intake mode, and then I'll start teaching again day after Christmas. Here in LA. I'll be here for a few months, and then next year will also be similar in terms of the travel schedule.
Right. So I take it most of, like what you said, you're not one to pursue opportunities, but you would most definitely respond to invitations if they feel right. So what happens then, Tara? Can you walk us through any guidelines that you could suggest for teachers who are looking to travel to other studios to make the experience as painless as possible, so that everybody's expectations are clear and that there's no miscommunication?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you kind of set down your own ground rules in writing, and also expect at the beginning that there's going to be a learning curve and you'll make mistakes. That's something all the mistakes I've made in the past, I just say, well, that was the price of learning. It's pretty standard when you go to a studio that the studio to teacher ratio has a split, and it will depend on the studio what that split is. So you have to, I think, as a teacher, always decide what's the trade-off for you. For example, studios that are in bigger cities often will take a higher percentage than studios that are located in a place that's not so costly for their rent, for their overhead, and Also realize when you travel to a studio, it is really, really expensive to run a studio. It's expensive for a studio, it's expensive for employees. So, there used to be a kind of standard 80-20 split, 80% in favor of the teacher, 20% for the studio. But pretty much all the studio owners that I've known throughout the years, that means that they're making no money. If they're only taking 20%, it usually means that they take a loss and that they're offering it as a service to their community. And that's something I think a lot of teachers don't know. They think, wow, why am I only getting, so what's more standard now is like a 60-40 split, 40% for the studio. And I've heard a lot of teachers balk at that split, but in fairness to the studio owners, most of them make very little money off of workshops, especially if it's not like a highly attended workshop. And, I've known studio owners who, are living in their yoga studio, who are taking all of their privates. I mean, one student in New York who had like 20 privates a week in addition to her classes, and all her money from privates went straight back into the operating of her studio. So, it's something that can look like it's not in favor of the teacher, but, it's just something to, I think, weigh out when you're looking at your possibilities. So I know a lot of yoga teachers, I think, outprice themselves for what yoga studios can afford. So I think it's important to be clear on the split, and also to consider what is the value to you as a teacher for going to that studio, because you'll have invitations to studios that can't actually fill your workshop or get maybe even enough people to cover the costs. So that's something to consider before you go. And then also to be sure what's included in the workshop. That they're going to cover your travel, that they're going to cover your accommodations, or what are your accommodations. My accommodations have ranged from sleeping on people's couches to, staying in a hotel, depending on the place and depending on the clientele. But always, I think it's really important just to decide what is worth it to you as the teacher. Because sometimes I'll say yes to something that really is a loss for me financially, but terms of traveling to that place, going to meet that community, or offering something to a community that is in need for whatever reason, the trade-off is more energetic rather than financial.
Right. Yeah. So what advice would you give for up-and-coming teachers who are hoping to raise their game and attract more students?
Well, there's so many mediums now for getting your voice out there. I think I use Facebook as a tool a lot. I mean, it's become for me a main tool in terms of sharing thought contemplations, in terms of sharing images, and starting to have an awareness of everything that I put out into the world and how that impacts people. Because the focal point of the classroom is one focal point, but you have now, and this is completely different than when I started teaching yoga, you have many, many, many platforms to get your message out there. And then that being said, to be very mindful, I think, of what you're putting out there, because it's not everything and anything. It's not as much as possible. I mean, you can, but that's also, I think, defeating the purpose of being very conscious. I think that it depends a lot on what your strength is as a teacher. Some people are very verbal, in which case their writing is a great way to create exposure, a blog, or offering insights and writings to things like the Elephant Journal or Huffington Post, or one of the many, many online publications. And there's other teachers that have phenomenal physical practices, and the way they get exposure is by just starting to create short films or pictures or some kind of media and throwing it up on YouTube, things like that. I mean, when I was first starting, the way to get exposure was for me just to teach everywhere and anywhere. So it was just teach as much as possible, and that was exposure. And now there's so many extensions. Like you have a virtual online presence.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting is to see how clever people are with that. How people create sometimes a blend of art and asana and words, like this multimedia exposure. It's a great thing to do.
Indeed. And you enjoy blogging yourself?
You know, I have been sort of confined at the moment to newsletters. I haven't been blogging that much, but I have been using Facebook a lot. I personally could write more. I enjoy writing. It is part of my makeup. I started blogging when I got to Bali, and then I kind of pulled back a bit. But yeah, I could blog a bit more.
I think I read one of your blog posts about that very topic. So it's an interesting thing that you brought up about social media and Facebook in particular, and being conscious of what you put out there. And it's a bit of a conundrum because social media thrives on being open and frank and personal, and and businesses that attempt to do social media without being personal often fall on their face because it's just dull. But how do you walk that fine line? How do you discriminate or decide on what you're going to include and what you're going to hold back?
I mean, this is to me part of a much bigger question. I mean, one of the things I do a lot of teacher trainings for teachers, and one of the questions I ask them and I ask myself again and again and again is, why are you teaching yoga? Like, what is the point of teaching yoga? What's the through line? What is it you wish for people, and what is it you wish for the world? And that's really the lens through which I look at everything that I throw out in terms of photos and my website. And it's something that I am in a learning curve on myself, because I'm not necessarily the most technical person. Some people, who are younger than me, they're social media and the computer and those things are, like a whole section of their brain that I have to actually work hard to understand. But I'm still trying to understand it better. How do I put things out there that help people wake up and become more conscious? And some of them will be controversial, and some of them will be personal, and some of them will, fall flat. And then I'm always happy that I can remove something also from Facebook. Oh, I should have said that. I think there's something about not putting everything up. The thing that I have the most challenge with in social media these days, not for myself, but what I see on other people, is they just want to put everything. And then it starts to be kind of like a self-canceling game. Because if you put everything up there, nobody's going to really look at anything. If you put everything that you eat, if you put every sign that you've seen, if you put every thought that goes through your head, there's no editing process about what are you putting out there, which is fine. It's also fascinating, but I mean, if you're trying to cultivate a yoga audience, perhaps streamlining is something to consider. Depends what your point of teaching is. What is your message as someone who's facilitating the process of yoga? Some people are more interested in being a celebrity, and the focal point of that is teaching yoga, whereas we're more interested in what is the process of yoga, and incidentally there is celebrity. So that's the thing I've seen recently change that's kind of confusing, is that people who are just becoming yoga teachers already are so conscious of the social media aspect of it before they even have much experience under their belt as a yoga teacher. An interesting phenomenon, and one that demands a little bit of examination.
Indeed. Well, and hopefully the people that are looking, the consumers of social media are learning to discriminate as well between what's worthy and what's not.
Yeah, exactly.
So could you tell us a little bit about your plans or your hopes for the future in the with the view that hopefully somebody that's watching this interview might get in touch with you and perhaps invite you to do something with them?
My hopes and dreams for the future. Um, I really want to keep offering. Let me put it this way: the most rewarding experience I've had in the last year is teaching the yoga immersions and deeper teacher trainings and contemplations. I really enjoy the longer, more intensive experiences in a particular place. Specifically, if it's in a place that's beautiful and enmeshed nature. Bali has been one of those places, and I what I'm seeing now is that I wish to offer more experiences like that, more long-term, comprehensive, and in a place that you don't have to drive necessarily. You don't have to think about cooking your food. That transformation is given space and room to marinate and insinuate itself into the system, into the body mind system of different people. So yoga happenings, yoga experiences are things that I'm more interested in. Teaching more meditation and also cultivating more like think tank experiences where different disciplines come together. That's something that is insinuating itself in my mind but isn't fully mapped out yet. But how can we create experiences that perhaps combine disciplines for CEOs of companies or of more influential people, so that what's happening in corporations and what's happening in governments and what's happening in people of positions of power is coming from a more conscious level. Mm-hmm. So, it's not just yoga for those people who happen to find it and have interest in it, but also finding how does an individual body, mind, personality network itself out into the world, into the environment, into things like that. Mm-hmm. That's definitely where I see myself going in the future. Hopefully, that we can create a more integrated experience for the people who are running huge organizations, and that start to trickle down into the mindset and the web of different, hopefully, countries and people and consciousness.
Wonderful. Sounds like a bright future ahead. No, I think it's important because it's all well and good having this wonderful experience during your yoga practice, but it's what happens next, I think, that really makes a big difference.
And I think to me that's one of the exciting things about yoga becoming more mainstream and more in the world is, okay, now we have a good 10, 15, maybe 20 years of a body of people doing yoga, let's say 10% maybe of the planet, hopefully, who knows. So what now? Like, what do we do now with all of these vetted body, mind, personalities? How do we access that information and make it move more into the collective consciousness? That to me is very much where I spend time contemplating, thinking, how can I facilitate that kind of integrated consciousness into a more mainstream way.
Well, thank you very much, Tara.
Welcome. Thank you.